Well, welcome back to the challenge of German nationalism. Today we're going to look at Metternich, the coachman of Europe, the leader, the master of the conservative order, and his struggle against the liberal nationalists, those who are trying to push for a new Europe and a new united Germany. In addition to unifying Germany, these liberals also want, as we would imagine, big reforms, liberal reforms in terms of freedom of speech, freedom of worship, assembly, even parliamentary reforms. Many of these students had fought in the War of Liberation, so they had strong nationalist ideals going forwards. We are going to create a living graph of this battle between Metternich and the liberals from 1815 to 1834. We're going to look at 10 different events. We're going to look at them all briefly, but we're going to decide for each one which of them is a victory for Metternich, and if it's a victory for Metternich, we'll put them in the positive numbers, and if it's a victory for the liberal nationalists, we'll put them in the negative numbers. Really negative if it's a total victory for the liberals, and really positive if it's a victory for Metternich. So let's start with the first one, the Wartburg Festival of 1817. This was held on the 300th anniversary of Martin Luther starting the Reformation, his standing up against the Pope. And we might see that as a strange event for a liberal nationalist. Why would they take this religious event to be a nationalist event, a victory for German unification? It's because they viewed it in the way that Hegel did. Hegel said that this was the moment when the Germans started to take on board the world spirit, to embrace it and to become it, to lead forward the nations and the people of the world and Europe at its center. So this is a moment of pride for Germany, for Germans, to see themselves as the leaders of Europe in terms of ideas of pushing the world forwards. And 500 students then gathered to mark the occasion, to celebrate Germany, to look forward to a unified Germany, and also to condemn Metternich and the conservative forces of Europe and these 39, in their views, pointless states, which are dominating and actually splitting up the German nation, which should really be in existence. So this is a victory for them. We'll put them down here on the graph because this is a great victory for the liberals. The next event is an assassination, and we can often think of assassinations as being signs of a lot of problems in society, that there are clashing ideas, that there is disunity in society. Think about the 1960s in America. You had many assassinations. JFK, the president, his brother RFK, civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King, also Malcolm X, all these major assassinations because there were these big clashes in terms of the new ideas being brought by the youth, in terms of the cultural revolution, the social revolution, the sexual revolution, and that pushing against the forces of conservatism of the 1950s, the American establishment, segregation, etc. We can also think of late 19th century Europe. Think of in Russia, there were a lot of assassinations of its leaders because there was such a discontent within society. There was such a clash between anarchists, liberals, reformers, and the Tsarist Russia that was refusing to change in the old regime. And we have this again in this period, again showing that there is discontent and disunity in society, that this new young generation is pushing against the old. And so we see the dramatist August von Kotzebue assassinated by a radical liberal nationalist student. And he was assassinated not because he was a political leader, because obviously he wasn't, but because he was strongly writing against the liberal nationalists. He was strongly critical of the liberal nationalists, and only recently had written an article against German nationalism. And this then causes a shockwave across Germany, a shockwave particularly to Metternich, the ruler of the conservative order. And he says, we need to do something about it. And he seizes the opportunity of this threat to carry out the Karlsbad decrees, which are a series of laws against the German nationalist students, aimed directly against them and their universities. And these decrees were agreed upon by the whole German Confederation. That means all the states of Germany. So it's a very powerful force. And they can include ideas such as banning and firing lecturers who believed in liberal nationalist views or were putting forward liberal nationalist views, banning the student associations themselves, limiting what students could say in lectures, and also using the forces of the German Confederation, its police force, its army force, if necessary, to shut down associations. So this isn't some sort of idle threats. This is not just some writing. This is a real enforceable set of laws. But there was some resistance. Some of the German states did resist the Karlsbad decrees. So we can't say it's an overall success. But crucially, Austria and Prussia would implement it. So in that sense, it was a success. But we're not going to say it's a tremendous overall success. The next event is the Congress of Trepöw, 1820. There had been revolutions in Spain and in Portugal, and they were liberal revolutions, liberal nationalist revolutions. And that was a threat to this holy alliance which had been established between the countries of Prussia, Austria, Russia, where they said, we're going to make sure that there are no more liberal revolutions happening in any country in Europe. Well, that's been directly overturned now. And so they come back together at this Congress and say, we need to restate what we've said before, that any state which goes astray, which becomes liberal, will be brought back into the alliance, which will be conservative and monarchist. So this is what they say. States which have undergone a change of government due to revolution, the result of which threaten other states, cease to be members of the European alliance. So if you have a liberal revolution in your country, you're out. You're no longer considered a normal European state. And that means we can do what we want to it. We can invade it. And so they will remain excluded from it until their situation gives guarantees for legal order and stability. That means they have a monarchy again. That means they've removed any of the liberal nationalist threats. If, owing to such alterations, immediate danger threatens other states, the powers bind themselves by peaceful means, or if need be by arms, to bring back the guilty state into the bosom of the Great Alliance. So this is just the Warsaw Pact, isn't it? The Warsaw Pact in the Cold War period would operate in a very similar way. If any state went away from communism, went away from socialism in Eastern Europe, the other states of Europe, of Eastern Europe, would invade, and in particular the Soviet Union would invade and put back a true orthodox Marxist-Leninist communist leader into place. And we saw that in many of the countries of Eastern Europe, notably Hungary. This is the same thing, and it's been stated very clearly. So I would say this is a victory, and a very strong victory for Metternich. He's not just using the power of his own state, Austria. He's not even using the power of the German Confederation. He is using the power of the whole of Europe, this whole structure of Europe, to ensure that he wins and that the conservative forces are upheld. As to carry out a great new repression of the liberal nationalists within Germany, within the German Confederation. And so in the 1820s, he tries to convert the Confederation into a police state. He censors letters. He establishes a network of spies to literally spy on members of the public and the liberal associations. But he has limited successes with this. If we think about police states in the 20th century, they were really powerful. You think about Nazi Germany with the Gestapo and the SS. You think about Soviet Union with the NKVD or the KGB. They could really reach into people's lives and control what they did. Think about the Stasi in East Germany. It had eyes and ears everywhere. But Metternich is not able to do this because the state hasn't expanded to the extent that it will do in the 20th century, when it can really control your lives. It really is like living in a prison. Technology is not as advanced to to the point where the state can reach into your lives like that. So this isn't a total success for Metternich. It is a success, but not absolute. Let's look at the next event. We might be thinking, isn't this going back in time? Is this picture of the French Revolution? Surely it must be. French Revolution, 1789. But it's not. It is a French Revolution, but it's not the one we're thinking of. It's the July French Revolution of 1830. And this was the overthrow of Charles X, who was the French Bourbon monarch. He had been restored to the throne after Napoleon, after the Republic, but he hadn't learned anything. He'd learned absolutely nothing from the French Revolution, and actually pushed to restore everything that had come before. He wasn't going to be a reformist, he wasn't going to be a liberal, he was going to be just as bad as the monarchs of France before the Revolution, in terms of his absolute control over the country, putting in power whoever he wanted, and setting up his own parliament and his own parties into power. He would be overthrown, and he'd be replaced by his cousin, Louis Philippe, which would inaugurate the Orleans monarchy. And he himself actually would be overthrown eventually, but we'll talk about that later. What happens in France often spreads across all of Europe, and that's something Metternich's very concerned about. And it will happen again in 1848, but it begins to spread. This is a liberal revolution that's just happened. Louis Philippe is very much a liberal. He's very sympathetic towards the liberal forces of Europe. And so he's a constitutionalist, constitutional monarchist, not an absolute one. And so these ideas then spread from France into the German states. And we see opposition parties, liberal opposition parties, gaining seats. Criticism is allowed. Freedom of press, freedom of expression. They're peeling back a lot of the Carlsbad decrees that Metternich has put in place. And so in Bavaria, Baden, Württemberg, we see the liberal revolution perhaps happening, perhaps starting. So I'd say this is a strong success then for the liberal nationalists. The next event is another of these festivals, Hambach Festival, but it's much bigger. 30,000 people go to hear these nationalist orators and plan a revolution. They are holding up the tricolour flag of Germany and making it incredibly popular, even more so than it was during the War of Liberation against Napoleon. You have great speakers, people like Bruggemann, who was an influential youth speaker, criticising Metternich. And so this really shows this consciousness beginning to build. Another victory then for the liberals and the nationalists. The next event is the Six Articles. This is another attempt by Metternich to take power and take control over the situation. And he increased the German Confederation's control over the internal affairs of the individual states. Remember, the individual states have tried to resist the control of Metternich and the Confederation, but he's now pushing it back in place, asserting himself again. And this included controls over the universities and the press, the same old targets of Metternich. Bruggemann, that great speaker we thought about earlier, is sentenced to death, arrested, although he would be pardoned ultimately. So this is a victory for Metternich. The next event is the cultural movement of Young Germany, which included poets and writers. This is mainly cultural. It's about ideas, and it's mainly about liberal rather than nationalist ideas, but it is very influential because Germany is now a very literate population. It's a very educated population, and what poets say and what writers say is going to really influence the opinions of the German middle classes. And so this is another victory for the liberal nationalists. The final thing is press censorship. This is Metternich, again, putting on the pressure of the individual states and even seizing control of newspapers who are espousing liberal views. So again, this is a Metternich victory. So what can we say then about the period? Well, obviously the liberals have won a lot of points, but Metternich has also won a lot. It's a bit like a table tennis game where it's going back and forwards, one way and then the other. But overall, we see that Metternich has been able to retain power through the whole period. No liberal nationalist victory has been strong enough to actually push out Metternich and his conservative forces.